Censorship has rarely, if at all, worked out for any nation ever in history. But we're going to look at some of the times where censorship went off the rails hard and caused major problems. This is the Continuum. When we think of censorship, we often imagine it as a modern problem. Books pulled from library shelves, journalists silenced by governments, or voices banned from the digital platforms. But censorship isn't a new idea. It is as old as power itself. And perhaps no episode in history is as infamous or as tragic as the censorship imposed during China's Qin Dynasty. Between 221 and 206 BCE, the first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huang, sought not to unify the land, but to unify thought itself. In one of history's most devastating campaigns, he ordered the destruction of books and suppression of ideas, and, according to later records, the execution of scholars who dared to question him. It was called the burning of books and burying of scholars. And while the Qin Dynasty lasted only 15 years, the effects of its censorship scarred China's society for centuries. This is the story of how censorship spiraled out of control in the Qin Dynasty, and how it hurt the Chinese people. To understand the Qin, we need to understand what came before. For hundreds of years before unification, China was not one empire, but many states, locked in constant warfare. This period, known as the Warring States era, was violent and chaotic. Armies clashed, kingdoms rose and fell, and rulers schemed for dominance. But amidst the turmoil, something extraordinary was happening: an explosion of ideas. This was the 100 Schools of Thought, a time when philosophers, teachers, and writers debated the meaning of government, morality, and human life. Confucianism taught the importance of virtue, respect. Taoism emphasized the balance with nature, simplicity, and freedom from rigid control. Moism preached universal love and the utilitarian principles, arguing rulers should work for the greatest good. Legalism, by contrast, called for strict laws, harsh punishments, and absolute obedience to the state. In many ways, this period was China's philosophical golden age, similar to ancient Greece with its own great thinkers. For ordinary people, this intellectual diversity mattered. It meant teachers could choose what to teach. Families could choose which principles to live by. Debate was alive, ideas were constant, and wisdom was passed freely from one generation to the next. All of that changed when Qin Shi Huang seized power. Qin Shi Huang was not born into peace. He came of age in war, learning early that survival depended on strength and cunning. By the late 3rd century BCE, his state, Qin, had grown strong through ruthless efficiency. Their leaders embraced legalism, favoring discipline and order above all. Unlike Confucian rulers, who sought moral authority, Qin rulers believed only law and force could unify a society. When Qin armies crushed their rivals and Qin Shi Huang declared himself first emperor in 221 BCE, he inherited more than territory. He inherited a fractured culture full of competing traditions, rival schools of thought, and people still loyal to the old ways. For Qin Shi Huang, unity meant more than borders. It meant that unification of language, measurements, currency, and thought. Standardization became his obsession. He introduced a single writing system, common weights, and uniform coinage. These reforms created a foundation for a lasting state. But he wanted more. He wanted to control the ideas themselves. And for that, censorship became the empire's sharpest tool. The most infamous act of Qin censorship came in 213 BCE. The emperor's chancellor, Li Shi, was a firm believer in legalism. He saw Confucian scholars as a threat. They constantly invoked the past, ancient kings, moral traditions, historical precedent, as a way to challenge present rulers. To Li Shi, this was dangerous. The people should obey the emperor, not quote dead philosophers. So Li Shi made a radical proposal: destroy the books. The decree was sweeping. Histories that were not Qin approved would be burned. Philosophical works, especially those by Confucians, were outlawed. Poetry and literature deemed unnecessary to state power were destroyed. Only books on medicine, agriculture, and divination were spared. Private libraries were raided. Collections hidden in noble households were seized. Ordinary people who kept forbidden texts could face punishment. Imagine the scale of this loss. Entire traditions of thought vanished overnight. Texts that represented centuries of wisdom and debate, gone. The burning of the books was not only about destroying words, it was about destroying memories. If people could not read about the past, they could not imagine alternatives to the present. Censorship rarely stops with ideas. It almost always extends to the people who defend those ideas. In 212 BCE, a year after the book burnings, Qin Shi Huang turned against the scholars themselves. Confucian intellectuals, horrified by the destruction of texts, spoke out. Some openly criticized the emperor. Others whispered their dissent in secret. The emperor would tolerate neither. Historical sources, particularly the records of the Grand Historian, written by Sima Quan in the Han Dynasty, tell us that hundreds of scholars were executed. Some accounts say they were buried alive. Others say that they were forced into hard labor until death. Modern historians debate the details. The Han who replaced the Qin may have exaggerated the cruelty to paint their predecessors as villains. Still, what matters is that the story themselves was remembered as truth for centuries. For generations, the Qin dynasty was synonymous with censorship and intellectual repression. Whether 460 scholars or fewer, the message was unmistakable. Thought itself could be punished with death. What did the campaign of censorship mean for the people of China? Loss of cultural heritage. Texts from hundreds of schools of thought was destroyed on massive scale. Some survived only because they were hidden by families in walls and tombs. Others were reconstructed later, from memory, but countless works were lost forever. This wasn't just an intellectual tragedy, it was a cultural wound. Generations of wisdom, art, and philosophy disappeared, leaving gaps in China's intellectual history. It also stifled debate. Where once scholars debated ethics, policies, and human nature, silence now reigned. Teachers taught only what the state permitted. Curiosity shrank. The living spirit of inquiry that once had defined Chinese culture dimmed. What was left? Fear and control. Ordinary citizens lived under constant fear. To speak a careless word, to preserve a forbidden scroll, to question the emperor, any of these could bring dissent. Censorship created obedience, but at the cost of freedom of thought. It also left weakness of the state. Ironically, the very censorship meant to strengthen the Qin dynasty may have weakened it. By silencing criticism, the emperor himself cut himself off from honest feedback. No one dared point out the flaws in policy or suggest reforms. When rebellion began at his death, the empire collapsed in a single generation. Let's take a step back and imagine the impact on daily life. A teacher in a small town might once have taught Confucian classics to his students, quoting moral lessons about loyalty, respect, and virtue. After 1213 BCE, those scrolls were gone. The teacher either conformed, teaching only practical subjects like farming techniques, or risked death. A family with a treasured ancestral library might have hidden their books in the walls of their house, each night fearing discovery. Each visit from officials carried the risk of exposure. A young scholar, eager to ask questions and learn philosophy, found his world shrunk. The debate that once filled the halls and courtyards had gone silent. His ambition was no longer to pursue wisdom, but to survive. This was the human cost of censorship, not just the destruction of books, but the narrowing of minds. Qin Shi Huang dreamed of immortality. He sent expeditions to see elixirs of life, and he built an enormous tomb filled with his favorite terracotta army to guard him in death. But his empire proved mortal. After his death, in 1210 BCE, rebellion broke out across the land. The heavy burden of forced labor, high taxes, and relentless control left the people resentful. Within just 4 years, the dynasty collapsed. The Qin, who sought to rule forever, had ruled for only 15 years. Their censorship, intended to unify thought, had instead alienated their people. Their brutally silencing criticism also blinded them to their own weaknesses. The collapse was as swift as it was inevitable. When the Han Dynasty replaced the Qin, they faced a monumental task: rebuilding trust and recovering lost knowledge. Confucian scholars, once persecuted, were restored to prominence. Efforts were made to reconstruct texts, often pieced together from memory or recovering fragments. Some families who had hidden books revealed their collections, but the damage could not be undone completely. Whole branches of thought disappeared. The Han rebuilt, but the intellectual landscape was forever altered. And yet, the story of Qin censorship lived on as a warning. For centuries, Chinese historians remember Qin Shi Huang not only as a unifier and builder, but as a tyrant who tried to control the human mind. Why does this ancient story matter now? Because the dynamics of censorship remain the same. It began with the promise of unity. It grows out of the fear of dissent, and it ends with silence, loss, and suffering. Qin Shi Huang's empire collapsed in 15 years. His Great Wall still stands. His terracotta army still amazes. But his attempt to control thought failed. The memory of his censorship became his true legacy, a warning passed down over 2 millennia. And it's not the only time in history that we've seen this massive censorship. We saw it in Nazi Germany, Stalin's Soviet Union, in Cambodia. This kind of censorship has happened throughout history. We will probably cover some of these. You have been listening to The Continuum.